All right. Hello, everyone. It's Wednesday, the 31st of January, 2018, 1 o'clock Eastern Time, and this is Student Affairs Live, the online learning community for student affairs educators in higher education. I'm your host, Heather Shea, broadcasting live from Michigan State University. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm grateful for the many behind-the-scenes individuals who helped make possible live captioning today for our episode. The producers at Stoner, as well as the panelists who helped mobilize a team of people. So if you would like to access live captions, they should be available to the side of the video in the live caption panel. And we also have a link that's posted in the website related to this episode that you can access the live captions directly. For those of you who are watching this video in archive, you should also be able to find a link to the transcript for this episode. So in a moment, we'll introduce our panelists who are joining me today to talk about this particular topic, disability in higher education, a social justice approach. But before I do that, I need to make a quick shout out to those who make these free webcasts possible. Today's episode is sponsored by ACPA, College Student Educators International. Support for Student Affairs Live is one of the many ways ACPA provides innovative professional development. You can visit myacpa.org to discover other personal and professional development opportunities, including the 2018 ACPA convention coming up in 2 months, I guess, so in nearly a month in Houston, Texas. And we're going to be tweeting out a link where you can learn more about how to register for that. Student Affairs Live is also a part of the Higher Ed Live Network. Our episodes offer you direct access to the best and brightest minds in education. Be a part of our live broadcast by sharing your knowledge on Twitter. Thank you to my friend and my colleague, Erica Thompson, for monitoring today's back channel. If you have questions for our panelists at any point during today's episode, you can tweet them to the hashtag HigherEdLive, and we'll do our best to incorporate them into the discussion. We are generally broadcasting live almost every Wednesday, but at least every other Wednesday at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. Tony Duty and I, my co-host, provide these episodes free and easily accessible in the archives, so you can go to higherlive.com to visit those. You can also subscribe to our podcast. Higher Live is produced by Stoner, a digital-first agency committed to tailored solutions that drive real results. If you've ever wondered what prospective students are thinking about when they read, receive, hopefully don't ignore your institution's recruitment marketing, there's a third study in the Myth-Busting series, which is a partnership between Stoner and NRCCUA, focusing on an enrollment marketing mix. So you can sign up now to receive information about this research, and we're tweeting out a link to access that as well. So now, today, on with today's episode. I am so grateful for the many behind the scenes, as I said, who helped make live captioning available for today's episode. But this work behind the scenes gave me an opportunity to reflect on the ways that we all need to be more conscious of a social justice approach to disability in higher education. So what does it mean to make our campuses, our programs, our professional development inclusive of all participants? And that is the topic of today's episode. I am deeply grateful to the panelists who joined me today, not just for the incredible text that they wrote, which we'll be talking about today, but also for their continued activism and engagement in affecting change on our campuses. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Nancy Evans, Professor Emerita of Education at Iowa State University. Welcome, Nancy. And Dr. Ellen Broido, Associate Professor of Higher Education and Student Affairs at Bowling Green State University. Welcome, Ellen. Dr. Kirsten Brown, who's a faculty member at Edgewood College. Welcome to you, Kirsten. And Autumn Wilkie, who's the Assistant Dean for Disability Resources at Grinnell College. In each of your brief introductions, I'd love each of you to share a little bit about you, and specifically including your pronouns as well. So let's start with Nancy. Hi, Nancy.
Hi, I'm Nancy Evans. I use the pronouns she, her, hers. Professor Emerita from Iowa State University, where I previously taught in and coordinated the College Student Personnel Association, or I'm sorry, the College Student Personnel Program. I am a white woman, wear glasses, have long brown hair, and I use a wheelchair for mobility.
Yes, also important to note that we are making additional efforts to describe not only who's speaking, but also what visually we look like, and hopefully to make sure that that's continues to be accessible as well. So thank you for modeling that, Nancy. Ellen, welcome.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Ellen Broido. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I am a professor in the Higher Education and Student Affairs program at Bowling Green State University, where I have served for almost 18 years now. I am a middle-aged white woman wearing glasses. I've got gray hair pulled back in a ponytail, and I'm wearing a black and blue jacket.
Thanks, Ellen. Welcome. Kirsten, welcome.
Thanks. Welcome. My name is Kirsten. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I am a doctoral research faculty member at Edgewood College in their educational leadership program. I am wearing a blue sweater today and have chin-length brown hair in this moment. I also am wearing glasses. And I think, although this is in my writing, it helps to kind of explain I'm dyslexic. And so although I may not come across as disabled to people until you read my writing and know my spelling. So
thanks so much for being here today, Kirsten. And Autumn, welcome.
Hi, everyone. I'm Autumn Wilkie, and I use the pronouns she, her, hers. And I, as Heather said, am the Assistant Dean for Disability Resources at Grinnell College, which is a small private liberal arts school. And I today am coming to you from my dining room, so you'll see some of my kitchen in the background. But I am wearing a brown sweater and a button-up shirt underneath, and also have glasses like the rest of the team, but have very short, buzzed sort of length hair. And like Kirsten, I identify as a person with a disability, a non-apparent disability. I am a person with obsessive compulsive disorder.
Thank you so much for all of you joining and sharing, and I'll follow suit as well. Heather, Shea, obviously coming from my office here at Michigan State University, which has a glass wall, often with students walking past. And I am a middle-aged white woman with medium-length gray hair and no glasses. So thank you all. So back in 2014, actually, I hosted an episode on Student Affairs Live about reframing disability, in which we began with an overview of some of the historical and legal climate issues to date. And I'm curious, since then, here we are 3-4-ish years later, what has changed and what changes might be on the horizon within the shifting landscape. So Nancy, I'm going to start it off with you. Will you talk a little bit about associations and scholarships?
Yeah. In 1914, Evelyn Pena also wrote an article that investigated how much literature about disability was appearing in higher ed journals, and found it was very, very minimal. Since that time, there's been much more productivity in terms of journal articles and research, particularly appearing in the Journal of College Student Development and the Journal of Disability in Higher Education, or Diversity in Higher Education. Also, we're seeing more featured speakers at conferences and more attention to social justice and disability at disability conferences. So I think, my own experience of having keynoted both the California Association for Post-Secondary Education and Disability and the Association for Higher Ed and Disability the last couple of years, it seems to indicate that people are paying more attention.
we may have lost Nancy's feed. Do you all see Nancy? Okay, she's popped out and joined back. Nancy, are you still there?
I just got back.
Okay.
All right.
It was an error message.
Welcome back.
Anyway, thank you. Anyway, the growing interest in disability in our literature and the growing number of scholars who are writing about disability and doing research in that area is very encouraging.
Great. I think that's a really important kind of point to make, is that is growing in attention. Ellen, can you talk a little bit about this from your perspective?
One of the things that I find really interesting that's a new development is in the world of disability activism and the rise of the disability justice movement. The disability justice movement is a movement to expand the conversation beyond disability rights and to recognize that disability is inseparable from all other aspects of social identity. So liberation is possible only if we address the full complexity of people's lives. It presumes that access is at best a minimal standard, not a ceiling, and it rejects privileging independence and says all human beings are interdependent, and that ought to be recognized and valued. It challenges all privileging of normalcy and rejection of that as a desirable standard.
Great. Kirsten, talk a little bit about the law and politics aspect of this.
Thank you. Yes. So I wanted to preface this by drawing from the ideas of Spade and saying, you know, the law really isn't socially just. And in many ways, we see the law as a method of reinforcing normalcy and injustice. However, it'd be really hard to answer a question about what has changed since 2014 and not include political or legal aspects. So I think in short, we know that laws exist and are made. For example, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, and the Americans with Disability Act Amendments Act, ADAAA. But really, sometimes what matters is how those laws are enacted through sub-regulatory measures. And under the Obama administration, we really saw the OCR focusing in on accessible technology. And we saw the Department of Justice with their Dear Colleague letters stating that the technology needs to be accessible. And those sub-regulatory processes were methods to affect change in a lot of daily living aspects for college students and then faculty and staff who are working in institutions. And it's still unclear the extent, I think, of the Trump administration's political changes and what those hold. I think we can safely say that if we're looking at the DeVos leadership in the education department, one of the things that has very recently changed is their understanding of how the IDEA, so the K-12 legislation regarding disability, will work. And recently we've seen the department rescind 72 policy documents on the rights of students with disabilities. So rolling back some of those protections. The folks at the Association for Higher Education and Disability, AHED, have been really wonderful about keeping us informed and tracking the political amendments that are being proposed to the ADA, and in particular, the enforcement of the ADA, and designed to weaken that enforcement. So I think that politically, that this is maybe not a space that is socially just, and that will probably show up in our legal system, but also in taking an intersectional approach. We really need to understand that students with disabilities are also holding racial identities, they're dreamers, they're LGBTQ or transgender. And so we have to consider the political decisions that go well beyond disability. But I think I like to try and show gratitude as well. And one of the positive things here that is this very powerful activism that's coming forth in our current political climate. And that's why social justice is an important topic.
And Autumn, you work directly in this functional area. Can you talk a little bit about changes in practice?
Yeah, I think a lot of the changes that those of us who are working in disability resources or disability services are seeing are directly tied to the things that Nancy, Ellen, and Kirsten mentioned, particularly a lot of the legal aspects. But I think some of the things that we're really seeing come out in the day-to-day, there's sort of three things. One is that we're seeing a lot of that activism show up on college campuses in the way that our students with disabilities are showing up, not only in our offices, but in other aspects of campus life, and the way that they, some students with disabilities are really working to reclaim or find a positive community around disability. And there's some aspects of the way that our laws work that make that really difficult for particularly students with non-apparent disabilities to find each other through things that are meant to protect privacy of individuals with disabilities. They can actually also serve as an isolating tool for people with disabilities. But we're seeing more and more student groups, particularly really active student groups, both locally and nationally, growing around disability. I think we're also seeing more and more that the field of disability resources is professionalizing, and that more and more people who are going into the world of disability resources, that's what they intended to work in. I would say that particularly a decade or more ago, most people who were working in disability resources were assigned to that area. It was sort of added on to their duties. It was maybe a portion of their job description. And I think as we've seen more and more students with disabilities attending institutions of higher ed and really looking for full access and fuller access to their education, we're seeing more and more professionalization of student disability resource services as well.
Great. So when we talk about a social justice approach, as the title of your book mentions, it's clear that that means moving beyond access and accommodation. So Ellen, can you start by defining for us a little bit about what that means specifically? What do you mean by a social justice approach?
So we start from a definition of social justice that Leanne Bell used in the Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice manual. So social justice has the goal of full and equitable participation from all identity groups in a society mutually shaped to meet their needs. And then we take that and extend it specifically to disability and disability in the context of higher education. So we really are looking at challenges to ableism that equates able-bodied and able-mindedness with normalcy, and that sees disability as abnormal, negative, aberrant, something that should be eliminated, or if not eliminated, rehabilitated. So it entails a focus on power and privilege in the lives of both disabled and non-disabled people, encouragement of a diversity of approaches to tasks learning so that there's not just one right way to do that, acceptance of diversity within disabled communities, so recognizing that the experience of me as somebody with type 1 diabetes differs from the other co-authors and anyone else, and that our experiences vary across time and setting. We claim interdependence as a value pulling from the disability justice movement. And we recognize that it's not just the environment, but that our bodies and minds have real and legitimate impacts on our experiences as well. So I like to say, I volunteer in the summers at a camp for kids with diabetes. It's about as perfect an environment as you can get for diabetes. And still, my blood sugars can be all over the map with some impacts on my ability to function. We recognize that our institutions must recognize that staff and faculty, as well as students, have disabilities. And a social justice includes an advocacy for inclusion and equity in access to and then within all higher education settings.
So when we think about this, how does this particular social justice approach differ from other types of approaches that either institutions or individuals might take? Nancy, do you want to speak a little bit about how it differs?
Sure. I think most disability resources areas or offices are still pretty reactive. They focus mostly on waiting for the student to come in, ask for an accommodation, and then adjust based on what the student says they need. So a social justice approach tries to look ahead and see, okay, what are the needs of students or students and employees with disabilities on campus going to be, and let's attempt to create an environment that is welcoming to those individuals before they have to ask for it. So much more proactive rather than reactive. Universal design comes in here in that the goal of universal design is to create an environment that works for everyone. So my cat is joining us. This is Sammy. Go away, Sammy.
Cats are welcome. So when you thought about this book, or kind of had the initial idea, who was the intended audience, and what kinds of hopes do you have for that audience in terms of changing higher education?
Sure. Well, it was my idea. It had been in my head for a long time. As a person with a disability, one of the things I've always been concerned about is that campuses seem to be interested only in the letter of the law, as it were, providing what ADA says they have to provide, and then usually doing that kicking and screaming. I may be too harsh in saying that, but partially that comes out of some of my own experiences asking for accommodations. Another thing that I've noticed is that it's mainly the academic needs of students that are attended to, that are written about, that we seem to be concerned about. And there was nothing about other aspects of student life that us in student affairs are concerned with and pay attention to, so that students can have a full, complete college experience that includes being part of the social scene on campus, being involved in activities and leadership. So I really wanted to provide a resource that addressed all of the needs of students with disabilities and faculty with disabilities. That was a comprehensive look at how higher education professionals can address these issues and needs of students. As we went about organizing the book, several things related to social justice, which is another passion of mine and my co-authors, were important to include. So we attempted to provide social justice strategies, challenging assumptions about normality, foregrounding the experiences of people with disabilities, recognizing the multifaceted nature of disability, supporting disabled people who might not need or request accommodations, which we have totally ignored, centering universal design as opposed to centering accommodations, treating disability as a campus-wide responsibility, not just the responsibility of disability resource providers, and finally, fostering a disability culture, so that there is an awareness and understanding of disability throughout the entire campus and environment. So those were some of our goals. And we will probably talk more about some of that as we move ahead.
So I have one other thing for you, Nancy, before I move to Ellen about some newer models. But I am curious, there's a section in the book in which you describe the medical model, the rehabilitation model, some of the other models that have informed our practice on campus, or maybe are currently informing practice on many campuses. Can you talk a little bit about why those have lost their usefulness within higher education, if they ever had a usefulness necessarily to begin with?
Sure. I think there are 3 models that dominate in the literature. The medical model, the functional limitations model, or it's sometimes called the rehabilitation model, and the social model. You don't see the social model as much in practice. It's mostly written about in the literature, but it really hasn't impacted the campus too much. So I'm going to focus on the medical and functional limitations models. The medical model focuses on what's wrong with the individual's impairment. The idea behind this is that we're trying to cure the individual, to eliminate the impairment, and medical personnel are the authority on this and have control over what happens. The problem with this is that in an educational setting, most campuses don't have that much access to medical personnel directly on campus to consult or to directly involve. Secondly, the problem with this model is that most impairments aren't curable. They are mostly manageable. And so the ADA and other laws have really allowed disabled individuals more power to stand up for themselves. So looking to the medical model for guidance really doesn't work very well in an educational setting. Functional limitations model, or the rehab model, I believe is the one that has really permeated campuses, the one you see as really guiding the practice of disability resource staff. In this view, disability is viewed as a deficiency that can be overcome. Rehab professionals treat the individual's functional limitations. Things like helping them to perform the functions of daily life is the term you'll hear most often. So dressing, bathing, eating, getting from place to place. What adaptive devices can be used to help individuals to, quote, see or, quote, hear. The power is still in the hands of those rehab professionals, but the functional limitations model is much more compatible with the idea of providing support so a student can function well in an educational environment. Unfortunately, it still ignores environmental conditions. We're still fixing the individual situation. Okay, it's the individual's problem. And so we're accommodating those factors in the person's life that prevent him from him or her from getting, having the situation they need to succeed in college. So we're trying to adjust the student's situation to fit that environment. Another problem with the functional limitations model is it doesn't really value individual differences. So it doesn't take into account some of those social identities that Ellen was talking about earlier. So those are really some of the problems with those models. The rehab model is very reactive again, very much waiting to see who the student is. We need to adjust to the environment that we have. We don't change the environment, we change the kid. Okay? So
Ellen, in the book itself, you talk about the emerging models that should take their place and how campus practices should differ as a result. Can you elaborate a little bit on that and kind of building upon what Nancy's just shared?
So we've seen largely in more academic literature, a couple of new models being promoted and used. And we think these have some promise for use on campus. They've not really made much inroads. The first of those is critical disability theory, and this comes out of the same frameworks as many other forms of critical theory, and it shares a lot of their characteristics. So, for example, really contesting strict definitions and binaries. So, for example, the folks in critical disability theory contest that there's clearly one group of folks who have impairments or disabilities and other folks who don't. And they point out all the ways in which those boundaries are unstable and fluid and change over time, right? So while some people are born with forms of impairment, many people acquire various forms of impairment over the lifetime. Those may be more or less salient at different points. So really highlighting that fluidity and instability. Social justice models are starting to get a lot more attention. So as I highlighted earlier, focus on privilege and oppression, on diversity within the category of disability, be that by experience, roles, other aspects of identity, and really carrying a focus on educating folks and eliminating oppression. And then there's a third model that Nancy and I developed that we're hoping gains some traction in other researchers' work. This is an interactionist model. So building on Lewin's model that says behavior is a function of the interaction between the person and the environment, we take that a step farther and we see disability as sort of the experience of disability as an interaction between the environment, the person, so their personality, their decisions, their skills, and the impairment. So again, impairments may be more or less prevalent in certain situations. I, as an individual, can make decisions that make I have diabetes, I can make decisions that affect my own functioning. And then all three of those aspects interact with one another. So these are three sort of much more contemporary models that we think have a lot of promise for how we work on campus. But Autumn can address more clearly what's really happening and what's influencing practice.
Yeah, Autumn, tell us more about what you're seeing actually in use.
Yeah, well, and I think one of the things, as I was thinking about as Nancy and Ellen were talking, there's a lot of ways where I think disability resources or disability services still is very stuck in medical and particularly the medical and rehab models. And a lot of the way that many disability resource offices operate is really foregrounding that idea of, well, we need a medical professional to tell us what this person needs before we can provide accommodations. And there have been some changes, and there's a number of campuses that are doing really good work looking at things around using a narrative intake model, looking at the information that the individual is providing about their experience as part of the documentation process. And some of that really starts to get into what Ellen was talking about with the interactionist model, really starting to think about how do we look at the individual differences that people who may have the same type of disability, but there's different things that are going to impact, and that could be things related to their individual personality, how outgoing they are, how comfortable they are advocating for themselves because of some of those personal characteristics. Could also have a lot to do with other aspects of social identity, the access that they've had to medical professionals throughout their life, the access that they've had in terms of their family background, in terms of talking about disability or talking about self-advocacy, the way that their cultural norms may show up in terms of, is it polite to sort of advocate for what you need, what you don't, things like that. And so I think a lot of campuses still are very stuck in that medical rehab model, really looking for somebody else to tell the Disability Resource Office what it is that individual needs, and then reacting to that. I think that there's a lot of ways where campuses, individual campuses are beginning to push back against pieces of that, and we're ahead. So the Association on Higher Education and Disability are trying to work on developing and are developing best practices around how do we have a more socially just model? How do we look at how other aspects of identity might impact? How do we look at and really critique our processes through some different lenses to think about, are there things we're doing that are alienating or parts of the disability or disabled community? One great example of this is a lot of letters that disability resource offices create that they send to faculty still include pronouns, but there's not a process by which people are asking what pronouns should be used in those letters. And I think that that's a great example of a place where we're not looking at the holistic person and thinking about how do other aspects of identity interact and impact how students show up in our offices.
So one of the ways specifically that you devote a pretty considerable chunk of the kind of a practical application in the book is around technology. Mm-hmm. And so kind of moving into a short conversation about some of these practical pieces, one of the things that I thought was really useful was the 8-step list for creating an accessible campus technology culture. So I found it useful because it was beyond just like, let's address this specific type of technology, as all of those tools are always changing, and instead looking really at the culture. Autumn, can you talk about that 8-step model, review those steps, and give us kind of an overview on the technology piece in the book?
Yeah, and I think that as I go through these 8 steps, I think that a lot of this, these sort of steps are things that can also apply to other practices that are happening on campuses in terms of thinking about or really critiquing how are we thinking about universal design in our processes and how that impacts access. And so in terms of that 8-step process that Heather mentioned, the first one is you want to establish responsibilities. It often really starts with figuring out who is responsible for ensuring accessibility in this particular realm. So in the realm of technology, who are the stakeholders? Who are the people who are going to be moving things forward? And that shouldn't be only ITS. That shouldn't be only disability resources. That shouldn't be only your communications office who's doing your outward-facing web. It really needs to involve a holistic team of folks, because most technology is not happening in a silo on our campuses. And so you have to establish responsibilities. You can't hot potato the responsibilities and sort of say, well, that's IT, so they need to take care of that. That's disability resources, they need to take care of that. You really need to be looking at how is the whole campus responsible, and how do you establish those responsibilities across campus. Then to really think about, okay, we've established who's responsible or who maybe is a stakeholder in this, to figure out what is it that we need to change or what we need to do. Campuses really should be undertaking pretty comprehensive assessments of the technology that they already have, the way that they're making decisions about technology, the impact that that technology may have, and that runs the whole gamut. That runs and includes not just things that are assistive technology, so things that might be accommodations, thinking about screen readers, access to that, but also looking at what platforms are being used in classes, how are faculty taught or enabled to think about accessibility as an important part of the software that's being used in different campus or different classes. I think a lot of campuses really fall into the trap of thinking about best of breed and what's the best package for this, but accessibility is often left out of the conversation. And one of the conversations we're having at Grinnell is, can it really be the best if it's not accessible and is leaving out a wide swath of your campus? So you want to conduct a broad assessment, and that should include the software packages that are being used. That should include the hardware that's being used on campus. That should include your outward-facing web, your internal-facing web, your email technology across the board. Look at every aspect of your technology. So in that assessment. And from there, you really need to develop a policy. I think a lot of campuses are have deferred to hoping that individual departments will take this on, will think about the accessibility of their department, and you really, really need a campus-wide standard for accessibility, and that needs to include procurement, that needs to include development. You need to be looking at how do we make sure that across the board accessibility is being looked at in our policies around accessibility. The fourth step is then you have to provide training. A lot of people on campuses do not know what accessibility looks like in terms of technology. If you're not somebody who is regularly using a screen reader, if you're not somebody who's encountering difficulties, many people just are unaware of the impact of inaccessible technology and what that can do. And so you need to provide training to anyone who's involved in technology. You need to provide training to anyone who's making decisions or thinking about technology. You need to provide that across the board. And then the sort of last three steps, I think, really then are about maintenance. One of them is about making sure that if your campus is developing its own software, if your campus is developing its own apps, its own websites, things like that, making sure that as those are being developed, that the development itself is taking accessibility into account. It's not just about the software that you're procuring from other places, it's also about what you're producing. You need to promote awareness about why this, so that goes into the training a little bit, but continuing to educate why this is important. And then you need to set up mechanisms to monitor accessibility. You can't just think that once you've put your policy in place, it's going to stay. You have to really be monitoring, making sure that things are being followed, revisiting that assessment stage, making sure that things are working the way you want it to, and also tracking advancements because new technology is coming out all the time. And that can really make a big difference in terms of what's being used or what is the best option for your campus.
Great, thanks for reviewing that. Kirsten, I know you had another thought on this as well.
Yeah, so I just, one of the things we see with this is that multiple people benefit from accessible technology. And that's why training is so important. And it's not just training solely the small, very, very small team of people who need to know, but the faculty, the staff, and the students. So, and I have a very tangible example. I use a lot of speech to or text to speech applications. So for example, there's an app on my iPhone that reads PDFs and Word documents to me. Because I'm dyslexic and it's a lot easier for me to listen than it is to physically read. I last semester had a couple students who were really struggling in one of my courses because they could not get their readings done. And in particular, they had a very long commute. I mean, they were driving quite a ways to class. So I suggested that they consider using the same app and that they listen to our course readings in the car during their hour-and-a-half drive over to class. And so if we had that type of training about technology for all faculty, all staff, and all students, then everyone would benefit from this accessibility stuff that is important for people with disabilities, but also very important for people without disabilities. So that's kind of a next step in looking at how this 8-step model can work across campus.
Will you share the name of that app that you use?
Sure. It's called Natural Read. There's a free version that will interrupt you about every 5 or 10 minutes with an advertisement. I use it enough. I think I paid $7 or $10 for the app and definitely got my money's worth. There's also, this is just what I use. There are a variety of other options out there. And Autumn, people can tweet at either Autumn or myself offline to get a whole host of options.
Yep. Yeah, we maintain a long list of apps and we at Grinnell keep track of how much they cost, if they're free, things like that. So if anyone's interested in that, feel free to tweet me at Autumn Wilkie or at Access Grinnell, and someone can send that to you as well.
Thanks so much for making those available. So on our audience today, we have a great live audience. We likely have folks in student affairs who plan events, who want to, maybe just don't know yet how to make those events move from just being accessible towards being more inclusive and inviting. Kirsten, can you talk a little bit about how student affairs folks can particularly attend in event planning to making their events more inclusive?
Yeah, definitely. So there's a whole host of tips, and I know we want to be conscious of time, so I'm going to cover a couple of these. The first one is marketing. I mean, if you don't know about the event, you really can't attend. And so marketing needs to be through multiple means, not just a flyer. Don't assume that everyone uses the same methods of communication. And for example, I think, and I've learned a lot from the folks with California Lutheran's Autism and Communication Center. They've been very impactful in my learning, particularly encouraging me to think about variety of methods of communication, such as iPads, sign language, etc. So consider the marketing and use multiple means of marketing. Also consider building space. And in particular, think about door accessibility, elevator accessibility, room accessibility, and bathroom accessibility. So a lot of times we think about parking and doors and elevators, but we miss the bathroom part. And consider if you're hosting an event that's maybe an hour or 2 hours, people do need to use the toilet, particularly folks who might be using wheelchairs. The other component of this is the topic of the event. So disability should be brought into the diverse speakers and events that we host on campus. And some of the ways to do that would be to create a disability cultural center, or even to include that as an intentional topic when designing activities. Collaborating with other offices. So students with disabilities are not the responsibility of just one office. And there's a variety of ways to do that through residence life, adaptive sports programs. Thinking about when you do programming, removing that deficit-based mindset and replacing it with a topic-based mindset. So for example, and I work within autism and learning diversity. So I'm going to pull an example from my research there. A lot of times people associate autism with social limitations, and so they'll host programs going, okay, well, let's develop a social skill, versus let's do a program on email etiquette, because everyone needs email etiquette, and that's not a deficiency mindset. So those are some ways that we can work on programming. Other components, admissions tours, study abroad inclusion. Including information about disability within the institution's marketing. And just basically assuming that you're going to have disabled students. And so having that as an awareness for everything that you do.
Thanks so much, Kirsten. So we are running just a little bit short on time. I'm going to ask my panelists to come back to a question if I now skip it and they want to refer to it. But I have one more question before we get to final thoughts. So when I think about the chapter that talks about multiple aspects of identity and thinking more broadly from an intersectional approach on our institutions, we're not just talking about practices and policies and approaches, but what are some of the ways that we might help student affairs educators increase their knowledge of students' intersecting identities? And actions. And I think that this relates to campus climate, this relates to the environment. Autumn, do you want to start with that and maybe kind of hit all of those pieces?
Yeah, I can try to cover some, and then my guess is that some of the other authors may chime in about things as well. But I think kind of building off of what Kirsten was just saying too, I think in student affairs, sometimes we fall into the trap of siloing and thinking about particularly minoritized students or students with targeted identities, thinking about them as the responsibility of one particular office and not thinking about the fact that many of our students are going to have multiple identities and are going to have multiple things that may be very important to them. And an example of this is that I think a lot of times campuses will think about how important it is to have their disability resource office be in an accessible location, but then won't think about how that same value is really important for their campus cultural centers, or think about that for their religious center, thinking about it for other things that might be really, really valuable for students who disability might not be their most salient identity, but it might be part of their experience on campus. And so really thinking about and critiquing some of this idea that students with disabilities are only students with disabilities and that they don't have other aspects of their identity, or just aspects of what feels really important to them. Being involved in community service, being involved in a particular club or activity, thinking back to some of that social environment that we were talking about earlier, but really thinking about how students with disabilities, like all of our students, are showing up with lots of different goals, priorities, experiences, ways of wanting to be a student on campus, and that you can't ignore that. I think some of the other pieces of that are really thinking through or thinking about how do we make sure that the ways that we're advertising things, the way that we're thinking about creating an inclusive campus climate, how do we even talk about disability? We haven't talked a lot about language or talked a lot about how to really develop a disability-friendly culture. I think that that's something that there are strategies that you can do. And some of it starts with even thinking about the name of your disability office, thinking about the ways that you engage people with disabilities or disabled people in the planning of your office and the naming of your office, things like that. Those are just some of the examples of ways to be thinking about some of that intersectional approach. In our book, we do talk about and have in Chapter 5, we have a number of strategies for thinking about how to support students with multiple identities, particularly multiple targeted identities. And that would certainly be something. I know we're running short on time, but if you're looking for 5 to 8 strategies, that would be one place to take a look as well.
Great. So I'd love to open it up to all of you. If you have specific questions that we didn't get to today that you would like to say just a couple of words about, and of course we can always do a part 2 to any episode that we have. And I would absolutely encourage folks to find this book and get a copy, which I think that it further elaborates on all of the things that we're talking about. But what are your thoughts? Anybody want to jump in with a final piece?
And I will just say that if anyone's looking for an accessible version, so a non-print version of the book, Josie Bass is the publisher, and on their website they sell the book in a couple different formats. You can buy the hard copy from them or from Amazon, but then you can also buy a ebook reader version or an accessible PDF version directly from their website as well.
Great. We'll tweet out a link to that page especially.
Yeah. Heather, this is Kirsten. I would say, just as a final kind of thought on my end, students, faculty, staff, and guests with disabilities bring value to our campus communities, and it's really important for student affairs practitioners to challenge that deficit mentality and that mindset. And so I think that's, for me, what I really got out of writing this book and learning through that process, and in learning through the process with you guys today.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Nancy, your final thoughts?
Yeah. I think the attitudes is something we really haven't talked a whole lot about. Creating a welcoming campus climate, which includes the human aggregate aspect of the environment, the people. And so the more that we can do to demonstrate to individuals with disabilities that we care about them, we value their presence on campus, we want them there, the better. And some of the things that we could do would be hire people with disabilities, hire RAs that have disabilities, have peer counselors that have disabilities, hire more faculty and staff with disabilities. People need to see people with disabilities functioning in professional capacities. Encourage students to get involved, nominate them for awards or for leadership programs. There are many ways that we can show people that we really do know they're there and value that they're there and know that they have something to contribute. Mm-hmm. And a final comment that I would add is that we need to make the assumption that people with disabilities are on our campuses. rather than assuming they aren't.
Mhm.
And always keeping that in mind.
Yeah, thanks for that. Ellen.
Yeah, I actually want to build on Nancy's final point there. So inclusion is everyone and every office's responsibility. All of us are serving people with disabilities all the time. There are always students with disabilities in our population. We always have colleagues with disabilities, whether or not we're aware of it. Faculty and staff disability is present in that population as well. And it's not any one office or program's responsibility. All of us have a responsibility to create an environment where folks feel welcome and included.
Thanks, Ellen. Autumn, final thought from you?
Yeah, I think I would just end with a challenge also to disability resource offices that we're not exempt from needing to review our own processes and policies and think about what places we ourselves may be infusing bias, either as it relates to the experience specifically around disability, or bias that might be alienating aspects of the population as it relates to gender, race, sexual orientation. I think that disability resource offices are also have a huge role to play in this and really need to be thinking about a social justice approach. And I know that can be really challenging. A lot of campuses are still very, very understaffed and underfunded in the area of disability resources. But the more that you're able to really think about how do I go beyond accommodations, how do I go beyond compliance, and really think about how am I supporting the whole student is an important challenge for all of us.
Yeah. Thank you to all of you. I asked you all to also collect resources in terms of websites, journal articles, et cetera, that we can post. And so we have a number of those, which we will add to the website that is the home of the video archive of this particular episode. So thank you for sharing all of those as well, which I think will be ongoing opportunities for folks who are watching to continue their development beyond today's webcast. So thank you to the four of you. I'm so grateful for your time. Again, I'm grateful to the work of my producers behind the scenes and helping make live captioning possible today, and to Erica Thompson, who tweeted the back channel, quoted the wisdom of you all. And I also need to give a shout out to my good friend and colleague, Keith Edwards. Many of you may have seen that I was absent from Student Affairs Live for the past 3 months working on my dissertation proposal. Keith willingly stepped in, and I am so grateful for his involvement in helping me kind of get through that next stage in my academic journey. And I am off to a running start because I'm going to be back again next week with another episode of Student Affairs Live. We will be talking with ACPA leaders, both from the Strategic Imperative for Social Justice and Decolonization, or Racial Justice and Decolonization, as well as folks from the convention planning team about ways that you can engage in conversations around race and decolonization on your campuses, and the many tools that will be provided at the ACPA convention this year in Houston. So please join us next week, same time, same place, watch.higheredlive.com, to learn more about those initiatives in ACPA. And you can receive reminders about this and other episodes by subscribing to our newsletter, also browsing our archives. All episodes are free and available for your use at any point in time. Again, I'm Heather Shea. Thanks again to our panelists and to everyone watching. Make it a great week, everyone. Bye-bye.